Hey everyone, before we get into things, let's take a second to think about what your day would look like if there were no buses, trains, subways, no LRT, no transit stop, just cars, bikes, walking everywhere. Kind of wild, right? Um, Public transportation is something most of us interact with daily, but we really stop to think about where it all started or how it got where it is right now. Back in 1800s, it was just horse-drawn carriages. Now it's a huge system of bus, trains, subways that shape how cities work and how people live their lives. Well, transit has made a big difference. It's boosted economies, it helped cut down emissions, given more opportunities, access to jobs, school services. But this is important. It hasn't been fair all the time. A lot of communities, especially indigenous ones, have been left out of the planning process. They're often stuck with poor service or no service at all. This is what creates difficulty in access to services and opportunity. So in this presentation, we'll walk you through how mass transit system has evolved, what kind of impact it's had on society, how indigenous communities have been affected, and some of the big ethical and regulatory issues that still come up today. Let's get into it.
Hi everyone, my name is Akshar and I focused on historical discovery and development of mass transit systems and how these systems have evolved over time and how they affect our society today. So, mass transit system dates back in the 1820s where it all started with horse-driven omnibuses which marked the first step towards the organized public transportation. That innovation led to steam-powered trains and cable streetcars by the mid-19th century. But a major turning point came in the 1863 with London Underground, the world's first underground subway system. This development laid the foundation for underground rail systems which we rely on today. In North America, we saw a big growth between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, especially in the cities like Toronto, Boston, and New York. Electric streetcars became key to urban expansion and helped connect people across the growing cities. By the late 1950s, there was a major shift. Why? Because car culture became to dominate, especially in the North America. As highways expanded and suburbs grew, people relied majorly on the car transportation, and this shift in priorities led to a decline in both funding and innovation for mass transit. But then, in 1980s, environmental awareness sparked a revival. A great example is Calgary's sea train system, which was launched in 1981. Our sea train system remains one of the most cleanest and most efficient light rail systems in North America. However, not all communities were included. Indigenous communities were often left out of planning and service routes, especially in rural and reserve areas. Now, that exclusion continues to affect mobility and access for indigenous people. Now, understanding the history of transit, it shows us that transit is more than just a technical system. It's actually a reflection of what society actually values. Whether it is equity, access, or efficiency, the evolution of mass transit system shows us both the progress we have made so far as well as the gaps that still exist. Thank you so much, and let's move on to Anabi.
Mass transit is a key part of building cities that are both sustainable and economically strong. One of the biggest benefits is affordability. It helps people save on transportation costs and helps connect them to work, school, and healthcare. It also saves cities money by reducing the need for constant road expansions and repairs. Transit boosts the economy too. According to the Canadian Urban Transit Association, transit systems across Canada generate around $19 billion in economic benefits every year and support over 120,000 jobs. And of course, there's the environmental impact. Canada's systems help cut about 4.7 million tons of CO2 annually. Calgary Sea Train is a great example. It runs entirely on wind energy, making it one of the cleanest in North America. But even with all these benefits, there are still serious challenges. One of the biggest is funding. In 2023, Canadian transit systems only recovered 35% of their operating costs, a major drop from 2019. That's led to service cuts, delays, and overcrowding, especially in suburban areas. Cleanliness and safety also need constant investment to maintain public trust. And when transit becomes unreliable, people stop using it. So while mass transit is essential for building fairer, greener cities, it only works if it's well funded, safe, and accessible to everyone.
We also explored indigenous perspectives and considerations in mass transit systems. A key challenge is the limited public transit access in rural and remote indigenous communities, which increases social isolation. This lack of safe transportation contributes to the ongoing crisis of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people. A national inquiry found that reliance on unsafe travel, such as hitchhiking, put lives at risk. Red River Metis scholar Jamie Fisher reminds us that transportation has enabled colonization in the past, but today it can be used as a tool for reconciliation if planned inclusively. This aligns with the TRC's 2015 calls to action and the UNDRIP in 2007, both calling for culturally safe and equitable infrastructure. We have actually seen some positive responses to these calls, such as the TransLinks Transport 2050, which focuses in Indigenous engagement in Metro Vancouver, and also the Infrastructure Canada's investment for safer routes in Saskatchewan. In closing, engineers and policymakers must work in true partnership with Indigenous communities in order to build not just infrastructure, but also trust, safety, and lasting reconciliation.
Ethical, regulatory, and potential controversies. When designing a mass transit system, there are a lot of challenges. One of these challenges is the increase in emissions due to manufacturing and maintenance. Even the trains, buses, and trams will themselves have lower emissions per passenger than cars. This number can sharply increase when manufacturing and maintenance are factored in. Another issue that can increase emissions is the distance traveled by these vehicles, since more distance will use more energy. One of the proposed projects in the real world that's aiming to solve this issue is the Calgary-Banff train, which is using zero-emission hydrogen-powered vehicles. Another type of challenge is regulatory challenges. As regulations around emissions get stricter and stricter, it costs more and more money to retrofit older fleets of vehicles. Calgary Transit has had to do this multiple times and retrofit old bus models with newer engines. So when designing a transit system, you would want to keep in mind the future proofing of it and would want to reduce the emissions way lower than the current regulations permit. Potential controversies in the space of the privatization of these mass transit systems or related jobs. Private companies usually only want to maximize profits. And if there's an area that isn't very profitable, they might reduce the service to that area or cut it altogether, which would be very bad for the quality of service received to that area. Anyway, thank you for listening to some of the ethical challenges and regulatory challenges and some of the potential controversy that surround this mass transit space.
Now that we looked at the current challenges, it's just as important to think ahead. How can we build better systems for the future? Transit systems are going through a big shift, especially with all the changes in technology and how cities are growing. More places are look at electrical buses and even hydrogen-powered trains to lower the emission and save on the long-term cost. But we also need to make sure these systems work for everyone. As more people move to suburban areas and as our population ages, we need transit that's easily to use. Things like low-floor buses and stations that don't require stairs or complicated transfers. Affordability is a big part of that. Students, seniors, and newcomers, lots of people rely on transit every day. And if fares aren't reasonable, it becomes a barrier instead of a solution. Programs like National Active and public transit funds are trying to close those gaps, especially in areas with limited options. We also can't talk about future improvements without mentioning Indigenous communities. Too often they have left out of the planning process. Going forward, involving Indigenous leaders and aligning with their priorities need to be part of the design process, not just the afterthought. Another thing that can really improve the system is better connection, linking buses, trains, bikes, and even car sharing into one network that makes commuting more flexible and realistic for people with different needs. All of this depends on a strong, consistent public funding. Without it, it's just a idea stays stuck on paper. To wrap up, we've seen how mass transit has grown from basic public transport to a key part of modern city life. It connects to everything: jobs, climate, equity, and safety. But how successful these systems are really depends on how well we address both technical and social concerns. People need to trust that transit is reliable, affordable, and designed with their needs in mind. That's why it's not just an engineering challenge, it's also about working together. Governments, communities, urban planners, and everyday users all have a role to play. If we keep putting people first and planning with that in mind, transit can be more than just a way to get from point A to point B. It can be something that makes life better for everyone.